All right, so now that we understand a little bit about synthesizers and the basics of them, if you remember from the beginning of this series, we were looking at synthesizers, and some of them can look like, spaceship consoles, right? Well, now that we understand some of the basics, we can understand what those concepts are trying to put together and or what they're trying to do with those concepts much easier. I'm not going to say that you're going to get into some synthesizers and, go, well, gee, what is that? Because you probably will come in situations like that. But hopefully by the time we get done, even already, that you should have a much better understanding of what you're looking at and what the areas of the synthesizer are trying to do. It's much better to take the synthesizer and break it down into smaller sections, smaller concepts to build larger complexities, what the synthesizer is doing. Additive synthesis, subtractive synthesis, and everything else that we talked about so far, that, those synthesizers may be doing aspects of those. And one other thing I wanted to address that we may or may not address directly here is other types of effects in the studio that, may be incorporated into the synthesizers that, may or may more or less be related to the topics that we've been talking about. And sometimes not. Sometimes it'll be some type of thing they're trying to do on some synthesizer that, it has respects and aspects that are related to things we've been talking about, but, maybe doing some things that aren't, a direct result of what are the concepts we've been speaking of. So there's a chance you can run into that every now and then, and that you'll have to investigate those aspects of that synthesizer, as you come across them. So I think what we're going to do now is we're going to get into the studio, and I'm going to pull out some of the basic synthesizers that I have, and we're just going to take a look at them. And hopefully by the time we get done, that we've addressed most of the parameters you may run into in synthesizers, and we may even look at some effects that might have certain aspects of them as part of the synthesis modules that you might be working in. So let's get started. Okay, as I said just previously as we started, that this synthesizer is in my studio, their premier synthesizer. It's called Mai Tai. Now, on this synthesizer, it does have an effects rack. So on the effects rack, it has a modulation effects rack, a delay effects rack, a reverb effects rack. It has a gator, an EQ, a distortion, and a panning effect. So, your synthesizers can have different types of, effects to go with them. On this one here, this is that one that I advise you to download to experiment around with, creating, sounds from different, type of synthesis that's free, and it really, it may not be, the top of the, it's not $1 million synthesizer, but it's free, and the actual basics and the construction of it are pretty well for you to understand a whole lot of concepts going on in a synthesizer without even having to spend any money. And even when you do have money, that's a pretty cool tool to experiment around and to look at things happening in a synthesizer. But anyway, it has its own effects also: reverb, echo, chorus, phaser, alien wah, distortion, EQ, dynamic filter. So, they can have those kind of things going on in them also, other than just the basic things that we talked about. So any of those things that you're dealing with that could be on a synthesizer that's not the basics things that we're going to address now are basically going to be types of additive synthesis that you'll be adding to it once it's reached a point to where you can add those things to it to enhance it. So I hope that separates that in your mind so that you look at those things as separate from the actual synthesis tools that we're trying to discuss. Because to me, that those are just like, a plug-in effects that you have in your DAW or plug-in stomp boxes on your guitar amplifier. They are synthesis tools. There's no doubt about it. But, it's the concept of them being separate from that and as, effects. Now, the other way to look at that is that some of those effects are going to work in conjunction with your synthesizer. So, you have to also be able to just sit back and let the concept sink in, is that those actual effects, on the synthesizer are actually can be part of and are part of constructing the sound. So, instead of it being an afterthought, that once you get done doing synthesis, that it's going to go on the end of it to do some type of effect, that it's actually thought of as part of the synthesis process. I mean, your modulation, delay effects, reverb effects, timing, panning effects, all kinds of things being thought of as one of those two ways, as an after effect to be put on something you've created in the process of synthesis, or something that's actually part of the synthesis that's, taken, into consideration, just like any one of the other parameters, and thought of as being incorporated into the processes that are happening and intertwining with them. Does that make sense? I know that concept sounds kind of hard, but you get things going on with your oscillators and your LFOs, and they're doing things in certain timing. Does that make sense? And things are happening in time. And there might be 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 things that are happening at different times that are coming together with phase modulation, frequency modulation, all kinds of things. Now, you put delay on that at certain times in that mixture, that it becomes one of those integral parts that's actually sculpting the sound and creating the sound. Does that make sense? And that's to try to relate that to where it just sounds really easy is kind of hard, but looking at it those two ways will really help you, and sitting back and understanding at parts of your creation that how you're going to look at those effects and what effects are possible. And also on top of that, being able to look inside your DAW or to effects pedals and things like that to actually incorporate them that aren't actually on your synthesizer. You might have a bunch of plugins or be able to download a bunch of cool plugins that together with the synthesizer that you can create, a whole lot of things, and also linking different synthesizers together. In this studio, we have what's called a multi-instrument. That means I can put like 4, 5, 6 different synthesizers together, and they're all in line, and then they come together, as one waveform coming out. All the synthesis that I've done in all of them becomes combined. So basically they become one synthesizer. So, I mean, those are some concepts to get in your head, that those things can get very complex, but, it's all part of the synthesis, using all the different aspects of synthesis and all the tools that are available. Because in that type of, in looking at it in that regard, that every plugin and every tool that you have can be part of the synthesis process. And also sound sculpting, so we understand that by using samples and things like that. So with that in mind, I hope I didn't drag that out too long to make that sound real complex, but that simple concept and those things we were just talking about, to try to be able to just sit back for a minute and think about that, as that being part of the sculpting and the sound synthesis process. So let's get started at looking at the synthesizer. All right, before we get on to actually looking at the synthesizer, one last time I want to make it very clear that anytime you're looking at synthesizers, that, the setup and how they're put together can be very different. So, anytime you're dealing with a synthesizer, that try to think about the basic concepts that we've talked about and where they're at on the synthesizer and where the effects are. What on there would be effects that wouldn't be the basic concepts we talked about, and separate them, and then if you have things that are going on that aren't, and either doesn't seem to be either one of those two areas, that, maybe fit into some other category, to really sit down and just one section at a time, look at that section and what all that's doing, because some of the things that might be happening are going to be very different than other synthesizers. Here's some basic synths that I use. There's Mai Tai. There's my impact, in my impact synthesizer. And, I go along and, from my impact and the controls on it, there's my Mojito. And then I come into, there's my Presence XT sampler, and I come into, there's Helm. It's a real cheap synthesizer that does some cool things, and the parameters and the way it's set up and the way it looks and how things might be different. Here's that plugin I said, that's C2 or Curve 2 CM, and the parameters and how they're set up and how some things are going to look different, and things like that. To really look at that and understand that that can really be a huge thing that can really frustrate some people. Here's another one that I got called Basil that I had fun messing around for a little bit, and it doesn't look like neither one of those, and then it starts getting this stuff going on, little chords going all over the place, and really understand that, to try to break it into small sections. And what is that little section doing? Because some of them can be doing different things, or they can be doing some of the same things, but the parameters and the way that it's laid out to work for the functionality of it can be different. So, try to, the bottom line before we start really looking at the synthesizer is try to, first of all, break the synthesizer into the basic concepts of synthesis that we've talked about. After that, effects, what is effects on that synthesizer, that are separate, modules, seeing how this is a module here, and this is a module here, and this is a module here. And, modules are usually fairly well separated, and easy to see that it's a separate module, and really kind of look at it that way. And then try to get the other category of what is something else, something that doesn't fit in either one of those categories, but it's obviously doing something, you know what I'm saying? And I know that sounds funny, but, that can be very true. I've gotten a hold of some synthesizers. I'd be just like, what the heck is that? And I'd be messing around with it, and then I'm going to have to be getting out the book, and trying to figure out what is he trying to do with that knob? What is that module actually doing? And it takes some reading because, before you can even relate it to any of those concepts we talked about, because of the way that it's put together. And I know that might sound funny, but there's been some times, especially when I didn't understand anything about a synthesizer, that it was very frustrating, because, and it made it real easy to break it down into those specific concepts we talked about. The separate area that is effects, we understand basic effects, and if you're working in the studio, you understand basic effects. And then things that just aren't, they don't fit into neither one of those categories, or they might kind of fit in that category, and so to really outline them like that and be able to look at those separate modules and really understand what's happening with them, because sometimes it's not as easy as just looking at the synth and going, oh, that's real easy, sometimes it's not, and you really got to sit down with that module and understand what the heck is going on here? What this module right here, what all is that doing? The basic concepts can be related to a lot of things we've talked about, and sometimes very differently, or they might be interconnected or with different concepts that we've talked about. So you really got to be careful of that. And the other thing that you want to think is signal flow of the synthesizer. Anytime you get a synthesizer you're working on, if you can, figure out what the signal flow is of it first, so where everything's going, how the routing is going. And if you go back and look at those videos I made on signal flow, that should make perfect sense, that you want to know where that signal is going, because you start turning knobs and you're looking at all these modules, where in what order are they being hit, where is the signal flow in that synthesizer? And so that's a huge thing to take into consideration. So in the next video, we're going to actually just start looking at the synthesizer, and we're going to look at maybe some aspects that aren't normal or some abnormalities, but we're going to just kind of cruise through the ones that I've showed you to try to address those parameters and what they're doing. But I hope before we get started that made sense, and if I rattled on about that a little bit, it's because there's been times that I did, and I would just be like, well, what the heck? So try to remember those basic concepts, the separation of those concepts, the separation of, the basic concepts, effects, something that might not be in effect, other things that the synthesizer might be doing that aren't actually related to the synthesis concepts we've talked about, that are going to be an integral part in what that synthesizer does, but may not be directly related to some synthesis. And your signal flow of the synthesizer. When you're looking at the modules, and what is the signal flow from one module to another, so that what you're looking at and where the signal flow is as you go through, sculpting your sound. So I hope I made that very clear and it wasn't too confusing, so that when we get started actually looking at the parameters, that you take all those things into consideration, because there's a good chance you're going to run into some synthesizers, especially in this day and age, that all of a sudden they got something new next week, and it's like, and it does this thing, and it's like you're trying to figure out how these concepts and effects and other things that might be integrated or interrelated, and take all those things into consideration. But sometimes it's almost a slight relearning process. So And with that said, let's get started in the next video.